They say a father's house is a child's first fortress, but for Miracle, it was the place where her silence became a crime. Imagine being branded a curse and kicked onto a lonely highway with nothing but the clothes on your back and the tears in your mother's eyes. This is the story of Victoria and Miracle, two souls abandoned by blood but found by grace. It is a journey from the dusty roads of despair to the heights of unimaginable wealth. A year ago, they were walking toward an uncertain sunset, carrying heavy bundles of the only life they had left. Today, they own the dawn. If you've ever been told you are a burden, watch how a mother's love and a daughter's silence can build a billionaire's empire. Stay with us to witness the moment the world was forced to listen to the girl they tried to silence forever. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comment section. The heavy scent of cedar shavings and rain usually brought peace to the Anderson household, but tonight, the air was thick with a suffocating tension that signaled the end of a sanctuary. Mr. Anderson stood in the center of the living room, his face contorted into a mask of cold, unfeeling rage that Victoria had come to dread more than the dark. For years, he had been the hard-working provider, a man whose hands built homes for others, but were now being used to tear down his own. He paced like a caged predator, his eyes darting toward little Miracle, who sat huddled in the corner, her small hands gripped tightly around a tattered doll. The silence that radiated from the young girl, once seen as a calm blessing, had become a thunderous roar in her father's ears, a constant haunting reminder of a perfection he felt he had been denied. The explosion came without warning, a sudden eruption of bitterness that shattered the last remnants of their domestic peace. Mr. Anderson's voice, once filled with sweet promises of protection, now slashed through the room like a blade. He screamed at Victoria, his finger trembling as he pointed at their child, labeling her a curse that had brought nothing but misery into his life. He didn't see a daughter in need of love. He saw a broken investment, a failure that reflected poorly on his pride. Victoria stepped forward, her heart fracturing into 1,000 pieces as she tried to shield Miracle from the verbal onslaught, but her pleas only fueled the fire of his resentment. He blamed Victoria's womb, accusing her of harboring some hidden darkness during her pregnancy that had stolen their child's voice. The once warm home, filled with the echoes of shared dreams and laughter, had officially become a place of sorrow and cold shadows. Mr. Anderson's love had twisted into something unrecognizable, a dark and bitter thing that left no room for the gentleness Victoria had once cherished. He stood tall, devoid of any visible emotion except for the chilling resolve in his eyes, and delivered the final blow. He told them to get out, to leave his house and never return, effectively severing the blood bond that should have been their greatest security. Victoria was stunned, the reality of being cast out by the one person meant to protect them sinking in like a weight of lead. She realized in that moment that the man she loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw his own family as a burden to be discarded. With tears streaming down her face, Victoria began the agonizing task of packing the few belongings they could carry. She moved with a hollow efficiency, her mind racing with a terrifying uncertainty of where they would sleep or how they would survive the coming night. Miracle watched her mother with innocent, trusting eyes, unaware of the full gravity of her father's betrayal, but sensing the deep, crushing sorrow that had overtaken their world. As they stepped over the threshold of the only home Miracle had ever known, the door slammed behind them with a finality that echoed through the empty street. The night was cold and the town felt vast and unwelcoming as they began their walk toward the outskirts. Victoria gripped Miracle's hand tightly, her knuckles white with the effort of holding on to the only thing she had left. They were no longer the envy of the neighborhood. They were now wanderers, two souls abandoned by blood and forced into a wilderness of poverty and silence. Behind them, the fortress had broken, leaving only the long, dusty road ahead and the faint hope that somewhere in the darkness, a different kind of grace was waiting to find them. The transition from the warmth of a home to the biting chill of the streets was a slow, agonizing descent into a reality Victoria never imagined. For a full year, The world shrank to the size of whatever uncompleted building they could find on the outskirts of the city, shells of houses with no doors or windows that offered only the illusion of shelter from the wind. They lived in the shadows of concrete skeletons, huddling together in corners and using their meager belongings as a shield against the cold. Victoria's life became a relentless cycle of survival, her hands growing calloused and her spirit weary as she took on any odd job she could find, scrubbing floors, carrying heavy loads, or washing clothes for families who looked through her as if she were a ghost. Money was scarcer than kindness, and there were many nights where the only thing filling their stomachs was the hope that tomorrow might be less cruel. The streets were a wilderness filled with hidden dangers, and Victoria learned to navigate them with the instincts of a hunted animal. She kept Miracle close, never letting her hand slip away, for the city at night was an intimidating place where every shadow felt like a threat. They passed brightly lit restaurants and shops, hearing the sounds of laughter and the clinking of silverware, but they remained on the outside, disconnected from a world that had no room for a homeless woman and her silent daughter. Every door Victoria knocked on remained closed, and every plea for help was met with a cold indifference that stung more than the hunger. The people of the city were far too busy with their own lives to notice the plight of two souls wandering the aimless paths of poverty. Through this grueling year, Miracle remained Victoria's only light, a child who adapted to the harshness of their life with a resilience that defied her young age. Though she could not speak, she communicated with her mother through soft gestures and expressions that spoke volumes of her trust and love. She never let Victoria see the full extent of her own fear, often finding small ways to smile or reassure her mother that they were together, and therefore they were safe. Victoria, in turn, vowed to never let Miracle see the depths of her despair, forcing a smile and whispering sweet promises of a better future, even when the words felt hollow in her chest. Their bond was forged in the fires of shared struggle, a connection that grew stronger with every day they spent evading the dangers of the street. They moved from one uncompleted building to another, always one step ahead of authorities or property owners who viewed their presence as a nuisance. Victoria spent her days scouring the market for the cheapest scraps of food, often going hungry herself so that Miracle could have a few more bites. She learned to recognize the look of pity in some eyes and the look of disgust in others, but she ignored both, focusing only on the daughter who looked up at her with unwavering positivity. The year in the wild had stripped Victoria of her pride and her comforts, but it had replaced them with a fierce, protective strength. She was no longer just a wife who had been discarded. She was a survivor, a mother building a life out of the rubble of abandonment. As the sun set on their 365th day of homelessness, Victoria looked at Miracle's sleeping face. The sun hung low over the bustling city, casting long golden shadows that did little to warm the weary bones of Victoria and Miracle. They had spent the last year navigating a world that seemed designed to ignore them, moving through the streets like ghosts haunting the periphery of other people's comfort. Miracle had grown into a young girl of striking quiet dignity. Though her lips remained sealed by the silence her father had called a curse, her eyes spoke a language of profound resilience and observation. On this particular evening, hunger had become a persistent, gnawing ache that led them to the entrance of a small local restaurant on the edge of a wealthy district. Victoria stood back in the shadows, her pride a tattered remains of her former life, while Miracle stepped tentatively inside, her small hand extended in a silent, graceful plea for a remnant of a meal. Inside the establishment, the air was thick with the rich, savory aroma of spices and roasted meats, smells that felt like a cruel taunt to a starving child. Most diners looked away, shifting uncomfortably in their seats or deepening their conversations to drown out the presence of a beggar. But in a booth near the back sat Chief Donatus, a man of immense wealth and even greater influence, known throughout the city for his solitary life and his conviction that family ties were often more burden than blessing. He watched the girl move from table to table, noting that she did not whine or persist with the desperation of the broken. Instead, she moved with a poise that seemed entirely out of place in her tattered clothing. When she reached his table, Chief Donatus did not look away. He looked directly into her eyes and saw not a dumb child or a curse, but a spirit that remained unbroken despite the weight of the world. "Come here, little one," he said, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention without the need for volume. Miracle approached him cautiously, her movements fluid and respectful. Chief Donatus realized almost instantly that she could not speak, but the gratitude that flooded her features when he ordered a full steaming plate of food was more eloquent than any speech he had heard in his boardrooms. As she ate with a quiet, disciplined hunger, the chief found himself moved by a surge of pity and curiosity he hadn't felt in years. He watched her closely, sensing that this child was a rare gem discarded by those too blind to see her worth. When the meal was finished, Miracle stood and bowed her head in a gesture of profound thanks. Intrigued, Chief Donatus followed her out of the restaurant, where he found Victoria waiting in the dim light of an alleyway. The sight of the mother, haggard, protective, and clearly once a woman of status, confirmed the story of a fall from grace that the chief knew all too well. He looked at the duo, realizing they were currently sheltering in the skeletal remains of an uncompleted building. A place where the wind whistled through empty window frames and safety was a luxury they could not afford. The chief, who had always preferred his solitude, felt the heavy iron gates of his heart swing open just a fraction. "This is no place for a woman and a child of such character," Chief Donatus stated, his eyes fixed on Victoria, who met his gaze with a mixture of hope and defensive caution. He explained that he owned several properties across the city, including a small, clean apartment that had sat empty for far too long. He did not offer it as a transaction or a burden, but as a sanctuary. Victoria felt the breath catch in her throat as he handed her a set of keys, the cold metal representing a warmth she thought she had lost forever when Mr. Anderson slammed his door a year ago. Chief Donatus made his choice that evening, a decision that would ripple through their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. He saw in Miracle a daughter he never had, and in Victoria, a woman whose strength had been forged in the fires of abandonment. As they followed him toward a new life, the heavy bundles they carried seemed a little lighter, and the sunset no longer felt like the coming of a terrifying dark, but the quiet promise of a home. The golden morning light filtered through the expansive windows of Chief Donatus's kitchen, casting a glow over the polished granite countertops that now served as Miracle's sanctuary. For the first time in 16 years, the heavy burden of survival had been replaced by the rhythmic chopping of vegetables and the comforting sizzle of a heated pan. Miracle moved with a grace that seemed almost ethereal, her small frame navigating the professional-grade kitchen with a confidence that left Victoria in silent awe. This was the unimagined turn their lives had taken, a transition from the dusty, hostile roads to a world of aromatic spices and gleaming silver. As Miracle prepared the first meal of the day, her silence was no longer a void of despair but a canvas of concentration. She handled the ingredients with a reverence that suggested she understood their hidden properties, a talent that had remained dormant during their long years in the shadows. Chief Donatus watched from the doorway, his usual stern expression softening into one of genuine intrigue. He had initially offered the apartment out of a sense of pity for the homeless mother and her mute daughter, but as he observed Miracle in her element, he realized he had invited something much more profound into his home. He saw a young woman who communicated through the textures of her sauces and the precise seasoning of her broths. When she finally presented the meal, a vibrant array of local delicacies elevated with a sophisticated flair, the aroma alone seemed to fill the room with a sense of peace that had been missing from the chief's life for a long time. He took the first bite in silence, and for a moment, the world outside stopped. The flavors were not just expertly balanced. They carried an emotional depth, a testament to the resilience of a girl who had been silenced by man but gifted by the heavens. As the days turned into weeks, Miracle's role in the household evolved from a temporary helper to a vital presence. Chief Donatus, a man who had long preferred his solitude and avoided the stress of family life, found himself seeking out the kitchen just to be near the quiet hum of Miracle's productivity. He began to teach her the nuances of his favorite dishes, but more often than not, it was he who learned from her. He marveled at how she could detect the perfect moment to pull a roast from the oven, or the exact grain of salt needed to transform a dish from good to extraordinary. The chief, who had no children of his own, felt a protective instinct stirring within him that he hadn't felt in decades. He saw the way she looked at her mother, Victoria, with unwavering love, and he saw the way she looked at him, with a quiet, profound gratitude that required no words to be understood. Miracle was indeed a silent prodigy, a girl whose hands spoke a language of care and excellence that the world had previously refused to hear. She began to manage the kitchen with a quiet authority, overseeing the arrival of fresh produce and the planning of intricate menus for the chief's business associates. Each plate she served was a silent rebuttal to her father's cruel claims that she was a curse or a failure. Under the roof of Chief Donatus, she wasn't the dumb child the town had whispered about. She was a brilliant artisan whose work brought life back into a lonely mansion. The chief began to treat her not as an employee, but as his own flesh and blood, insisting on paying her a generous salary and ensuring she had everything she needed to flourish. In this safe haven, the trauma of the roadside started to fade, replaced by the warmth of a father figure who valued her precisely for who she was. Victoria watched this bond grow with a heart full of both joy and a lingering, cautious fear. She saw her daughter transforming into a young woman of substance and power, yet she knew that such rapid elevation often drew the eyes of the envious. For now, however, the kitchen remained their fortress, a place where Miracle's brilliance shone brighter than any spoken word. The chief would often sit at the small breakfast nook, watching Miracle work, and remark that her presence was the greatest blessing his house had ever known. It was a period of profound healing, a year where the unimagined was becoming their new reality, and the girl who had once been kicked out like trash was now the cornerstone of a billionaire's peace. The golden afternoon sun filtered through the tall, arched windows of Chief Donatus's mansion, casting long, peaceful shadows across the polished marble floors, but the tranquility was merely a fragile mask for the storm approaching the gates. Inside the expansive kitchen, Miracle moved with a fluid, silent grace that had become the heartbeat of the home, her hands expertly seasoning a rich local stew that filled the air with the scent of home and healing. Chief Donatus sat nearby in his favorite armchair, watching her with the proud, contented eyes of a father who had finally found the family he never thought he needed. He marveled at how this quiet girl, once a shivering figure on the roadside, had transformed his empty halls into a sanctuary of warmth and purpose. He had already made up his mind that his vast legacy would not go to waste. It would go to those who understood the value of a hand held out in the dark. However, the heavy iron gates groaned as a car screeched into the driveway, signaling the arrival of a man whose heart was as hollow as the chief's was full. Dominic, the chief's cousin, did not knock. He stormed into the living room like a whirlwind of entitlement and suppressed rage. For years, he had treated Chief Donatus like a personal bank, squandering every opportunity and every stack of currency handed to him on reckless living and failed schemes. Even now, the chief was the one quietly ensuring Dominic's children remained in school, yet Dominic felt no gratitude, only a burning sense of ownership over wealth he had never lifted a finger to build. He had heard the whispers in the city, rumors that his cousin had taken in street beggars and was treating a mute girl like royalty, and the jealousy had fermented into a lethal bitterness in his soul. Dominic's eyes scanned the room, landing on Victoria as she entered to set the table, and his lip curled in a sneer of pure disgust. He saw her not as a woman who had survived the unthinkable, but as a parasite threatening his birthright. He didn't wait for a greeting before his voice tore through the peace of the house, a sharp, ugly sound that made Miracle flinch in the kitchen. He demanded to know why Chief Donatus was wasting his influence and his funds on nobodies from the gutter, while his own flesh and blood had to ask for every penny. His face was contorted, his hands shaking with a greed that had long ago replaced his humanity. He looked toward the kitchen, where Miracle stood frozen, and his words became even more venomous, labeling her a dumb child who was bewitching the chief with her silent act. Chief Donatus stood up, his usual gentleness replaced by a towering righteous indignation that made even the walls seem to shrink. He reminded Dominic of the countless fortunes he had already burned through, the lies he had told, and the responsibilities he had abandoned. The chief's voice was firm, stating clearly that being flesh and blood did not grant one the right to be a predator. He made it known that Victoria and Miracle had brought more light into his life in months than Dominic had in decades, and he would not tolerate their dignity being insulted in their own home. The confrontation was a fierce showdown of values, one man protecting the vulnerable, the other protecting his greed. Stunned by the force of the chief's rejection, Dominic fell into a chilling silence, the truth of his failures laid bare before him. But he did not feel shame. He felt a cold, calculated resolve. As he turned to storm out, slamming the heavy doors behind him, he cast one last look at the mansion he felt was being stolen from him. In the shadows of his mind, a dark plan was already forming, a way to ensure that if he could not have the chief's wealth, then the street beggars would certainly not have it either. The peace in the house was restored for the evening, but the shadow Dominic left behind was long and jagged, a warning of the tragic chain of events he was about to set in motion. The golden light of the early morning usually brought a sense of peace to the mansion, filtering through the high windows and dancing across the polished floors, but today the sun felt cold and distant. Miracle moved through the quiet hallways with her usual grace, the soft soles of her shoes barely making a sound against the marble. She had already gathered the freshest herbs from the garden, her mind busy planning a special breakfast for Chief Donatus, the man who had seen her worth when the rest of the world looked away. He was more than a benefactor. He was the father figure who had restored the dignity that Mr. Anderson had tried so hard to crush. As she approached his study, the usual aroma of brewing coffee was missing, replaced by a heavy, chilling silence that made the hair on her arms stand up. She pushed the door open gently, expecting to see him hunched over his morning ledgers or staring thoughtfully out at the city he helped build. Instead, she found him sprawled motionless across the ornate rug, his hand outstretched as if reaching for a help that never came. The basket of herbs slipped from Miracle's hands, scattering green leaves across the floor like a broken offering. She rushed to his side, her heart hammering against her ribs with a violence that made her dizzy. She knelt in the dust, her hands trembling as she touched his shoulder, then his cheek. His skin was like cooling stone. She shook him, a silent scream building in her throat, her eyes wide with a terror that no words could ever capture. She tried to pull him up, to breathe life back into the man who had given her a reason to live, but the weight of his body was final. Chief Donatus was gone, and with him, the only safety she and Victoria had ever known. The panic was a physical thing, clawing at her chest, yet she was trapped in the prison of her own biology. She wanted to wail, to shout for the servants, to call for an ambulance, but only a sharp, ragged intake of breath escaped her lips. Just as the realization of her loss began to sink in, the heavy doors of the study burst open. It wasn't the household staff who entered, but a swarm of police officers, led by a grim-faced Dominic. The timing was too perfect, the arrival too swift, but Miracle was too drowned in grief to see the trap closing around her. Dominic stood in the doorway, his face twisted into a mask of false horror, pointing a shaking finger at the girl huddled over the body. The officers didn't see a grieving daughter, they saw a suspect caught in the act. They saw the dumb girl who had been the last person to serve the chief his tea the night before. As they pulled her away from the body, Miracle fought back, her gestures frantic and wild. She pointed to her heart, then to the chief, trying to show them the bond they shared, but they misinterpreted her desperation as the erratic behavior of a killer. The cold steel of handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists, a sound that echoed like a death knell in the quiet room. She looked at the officers, her eyes pleading for them to understand, to look at the evidence, to see the truth, but they looked through her as if she were a ghost. The silence that had once been her sanctuary was now being used as a weapon against her. Because she could not speak, she could not tell them about the strange visitor she had seen near the study late at night, or the way the CCTV cameras had been mysteriously dark. Dominic watched from the shadows, a glint of triumph in his eyes as he watched the girl who had stolen his inheritance being dragged toward a police cruiser. As the sirens began to wail, cutting through the stillness of the morning, Miracle felt the world slipping away. She was being taken to a place where her voice would matter even less than it did on the streets, leaving Victoria alone once more to face a darkness that had returned with a vengeance. The fortress had not just broken, it had been demolished, and the cold morning air offered no mercy for the innocent. The apartment that had once been a sanctuary of warmth and aromatic spices was now a tomb of silence and shadows, and within its walls, Victoria sat on the cold floor, her spirit completely extinguished. The man who had rescued them from the gutter, Chief Donatus, was gone, and the daughter who was her only reason for breathing was behind bars, accused of a crime that felt like a sick joke. It was in this moment of absolute vulnerability that the door creaked open, admitting a man who wore a mask of concern over a heart of stone. Dominic stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the space with a predator's calculation, even as he lowered his voice to a tone of practiced, oily sympathy. He did not come with food or legal counsel. He came with a poison more subtle than the one that had claimed the chief, the poison of a false hope designed to isolate a mother from her child. Dominic sat beside Victoria, his presence feeling like a heavy shroud, and began to weave a web of deceit that exploited her deepest fears. He spoke of the harshness of the law and the certainty of a death sentence for Miracle if things continued on their current path. He told Victoria that the evidence was insurmountable and that the girl's silence was being viewed by the judge not as a disability, but as a stubborn admission of guilt. "They see her quietness as the coldness of a killer," Dominic whispered, his words intended to pierce Victoria's heart and shatter her resolve. He then presented his solution, a path he claimed was the only way to save Miracle from the gallows. He urged Victoria to convince her daughter to confess, promising that a plea of guilt would move the court to show mercy and grant a lighter sentence. Victoria, blinded by her tears and exhausted by days of relentless trauma, clung to Dominic's words as if they were a divine lifeline. She had no one else to turn to, no money for a high-powered lawyer, and no understanding of the legal trap being set for her family. Dominic played his role perfectly, acting the part of the grieving cousin who only wanted to prevent further tragedy within the family circle. He watched with inward satisfaction as Victoria's resistance crumbled, her desperation to keep her daughter alive overriding her knowledge of Miracle's innocent nature. He knew that if Miracle confessed, his own trail would be buried forever, and the fortune of Chief Donatus would be ripe for his picking once the murderer was tucked away in a distant prison cell. When Victoria was finally granted a visit to the station, she entered the room not as an advocate, but as the unwitting messenger of the wolf. She saw Miracle sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, looking fragile and broken, her eyes wide with a terror that no gesture could fully express. Victoria took her daughter's trembling hands and, with a voice cracked by desperation, began to plead the case Dominic had built. She begged Miracle to lie, to say she had done the unthinkable, all for the sake of a mercy that did not actually exist. The air in the room became thick with a new kind of tragedy as the bond between mother and daughter began to fray under the pressure of this forced betrayal. Miracle's reaction was a silent scream of agony. She shook her head with a fierce, desperate energy, her eyes filling with a profound sense of hurt as she realized her own mother was asking her to betray the memory of the man who had truly loved them. She could not understand how Victoria could believe such a lie, or why the world was suddenly demanding that she trade her integrity for her life. But Victoria, pushed to the brink by Dominic's lies, misinterpreted Miracle's refusal as stubbornness or a lack of understanding. Frustration turned into a bitter, panicked anger, and Victoria lashed out with cruel words, calling Miracle senseless and dumb for not taking the path of survival. Each word was a dagger that Dominic had sharpened and placed in Victoria's hand, and as Miracle wept in silent, heaving sobs, the isolation was complete. The girl who had no voice to defend herself now had no mother to believe her, leaving her utterly alone in the dark as the trial loomed like a shadow over their fractured lives. The atmosphere in the courtroom was a suffocating shroud of polished wood and cold finality, a place where silence was not respected but weaponized against those who could not speak. Victoria sat in the gallery, her body trembling with a rhythmic, heart-wrenching sob that she tried to stifle behind her worn palms. She watched as Miracle stood in the dock, looking smaller and more fragile than she ever had during their years on the streets. The prosecution had been ruthless, painting Miracle's quiet nature as a sinister mask and her presence at Chief Donatus's side as a calculated move by a predator. Because Miracle had no voice to recount the final moments of the man who had been her savior, the court saw only the shadow of a crime she had never committed. When the judge finally spoke, the words life imprisonment landed with the weight of a leaden hammer, shattering the air and echoing through the chambers like a funeral bell. Miracle did not scream. She simply looked at her mother, her eyes wide with a terrifying disbelief that words could never have expressed, as the officers moved in to lead her away into the darkness of the system. As Miracle was dragged toward a fate of iron bars and stone walls, Dominic stood in the back of the courtroom, a twisted smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. To him, the conviction was a masterclass in manipulation, a victory that paved a golden road to the inheritance he believed was his birthright. He watched Victoria collapse into her seat, a broken woman once again homeless and now childless, and felt only a surge of smug satisfaction. With Miracle locked away and Chief Donatus in the grave, Dominic believed the vast empire of properties and businesses was finally within his grasp. He wasted no time, heading straight from the courthouse to the office of the chief's estate lawyer, his mind already tallying the millions he intended to squander. He entered the office with the stride of a conqueror, demanding to see the final testament of his late cousin, confident that the law would now recognize him as the sole heir. The lawyer, a man of stern countenance and unreadable eyes, motioned for Dominic to sit. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed to mock Dominic's impatience. As the seal on the will was broken, Dominic leaned forward, his heart racing with a greed that had grown to monstrous proportions. But as the lawyer began to read the cold legal prose, the smug smile on Dominic's face began to wither like a dying leaf. The will did not speak of Dominic's loyalty or his blood right. Instead, it spoke of a deep, abiding love for a girl who had brought light back into a lonely man's life. Chief Donatus had willed the vast majority of his properties to an orphanage, but the crown jewels of his estate, the grandest mansion in the city and his primary company, had been left entirely to Miracle. Dominic's face turned a violent shade of red, the shock hitting him like a physical blow. He gripped the edges of the mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white as he listened to the lawyer explain that Miracle was now, on paper, one of the wealthiest young women in the region. The irony was a bitter poison. He had gone to extreme lengths to frame her, thinking that her conviction would remove her from the line of succession, only to find that the chief had anticipated the greed of his relatives. However, the lawyer's voice remained flat as he delivered the final twist. Because Miracle had been sentenced to life in prison, the law prevented her from taking immediate control of the assets. The properties would be held in a trust for the less privileged until such a time as she could claim them, or they would be donated entirely if the conviction stood. Dominic had succeeded in destroying Miracle's life, but in doing so, he had permanently locked himself out of the fortune he had killed for. He stormed out of the office, his mind spinning in a whirlwind of rage and bitterness, realizing that his pursuit of wealth had left him with nothing but the blood on his hands and an empty pocket. The garden where Victoria sat was a place of deceptive peace, a quiet sanctuary that felt like a mockery of the storm currently destroying her life. For weeks, she had endured the agonizing silence of an empty home, haunted by the image of Miracle behind iron bars, sentenced to a life of darkness for a crime she could never commit. Victoria's prayers had turned into desperate whispers, questioning why a daughter who had never spoken a word of malice was being punished by a world that refused to hear her innocence. The weight of her failure to protect Miracle pressed down on her soul until the simple act of breathing felt like a struggle against the tide of despair. The sudden trill of her phone shattered the morning stillness, and Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs with a sudden, inexplicable dread. The caller was Dominic's ex-wife, a woman who had fled to the United Kingdom months ago to escape the shadow of her husband's growing darkness. Her voice over the line was frantic and heavy with the burden of a secret that had finally become too large to carry. She confessed to Victoria that on the eve of Chief Donatus's death, she had overheard Dominic boasting about his plan to secure the family fortune. He had admitted to disconnecting the security cameras and slipping a lethal poison into the chief's evening tea, driven by a twisted greed that saw a mute girl as nothing more than a convenient scapegoat. The recording she possessed was the final nail in the coffin of Dominic's lies, a digital ghost that spoke the truth when Miracle could not. Victoria did not wait for the sun to set before she reached the authorities, the recording of the confession playing like a victory march in her mind. The evidence was undeniable, stripping away the thin veil of Dominic's false concern and revealing the predator beneath. Within hours, the legal machinery that had so efficiently crushed Miracle began to turn in her favor. Dominic was intercepted by the police, his smug confidence dissolving into a pathetic display of regret as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The conviction was overturned with a speed that felt like divine intervention, and the gates of the prison finally swung open to release the girl the world had tried to bury. As Miracle walked into the golden light of freedom, Victoria was there to catch her, the two of them collapsing into an embrace that bridged years of suffering and silence. They wept not for what they had lost, but for the impossible grace of the moment. It was then, as they pulled apart to look at one another, that the truly unimagined happened. Miracle's lips parted, and a sound emerged that was clearer than any bell and more powerful than any storm. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, the words vibrating with a resonance that left the surrounding lawyers and officers in a state of stunned disbelief. The voice that had been locked away for 20 years had finally found its key, released by the shattering of the injustice that had held it captive. In the weeks that followed, the transition of power was absolute. Chief Donatus's lawyer handed over the keys and the legal titles to a billion-dollar empire, a vast network of companies and mansions that the chief had always intended for the girl who saw the world through eyes of kindness. Miracle stepped into her role not as a victim, but as a visionary leader. She walked through the halls of her new company with a quiet confidence, her voice now a tool of advocacy for the forgotten and the silenced. She and Victoria moved into the grand mansion that had once been a dream, a place where the echoes of their struggle were replaced by the sounds of a life fully lived. The road of tears had finally led them home, proving that while a father's house could be broken, a mother's love and a daughter's truth were foundations that could never be destroyed.